I'm Algimantas Kacys from Lithuanian Skeptics Society. And this time, after summer's break, we are back to a new episode of Skeptics podcast. And this time, my guest is Kateryna Zorya. Hello, Kateryna.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
I met Kateryna in ESVE conference. It is a conference which happens every year or every 2 years, and it gathers all the scientists who are researching Western esotericism. So in that conference, I did meet Kateryna, and it was like a jewel, new thing for me. As I was expecting one person from Germany, and she didn't came to that conference. I found out Kateryna, and I said, wow, this is much more interesting what she's into and what she has to offer in terms of her scientific research. It was mind-blowing after a couple of talks what I found out, and I will explain and share with you later. But Kateryna at the start was so skeptical at me, she was almost furious, I could say. She was walking around and listening. As I was introducing myself to other participants, I'm Algimantas from Skeptical organization, and Kateryna was like, what the hell, those skeptics? And I like 3 times or something like that saw an expression on Kateryna's face, and I said, what's wrong with that person? Why she's so suspicious to me? You know, what the hell, you know? And just later, after all the presentations, I have a time to meet with her, and she said, you are okay. I now understand why you were so suspicious on me.
Right. So this is actually sort of a funny story, but the first time I actually learned about the skeptics as a global movement was actually at an ESVE conference. I think that one took place maybe 10 years ago now in Gothenburg. I think it was ESVE 4. And the reason I learned about them at the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism conference is really because in a lot of context, not necessarily perhaps in the Eastern European or pro-Soviet one, but in a lot of contexts, skeptical movements actually overlap to an extent with esoterical movements, both because they draw from the same actual cohort of people who are interested in science, in knowledge, in making things better for humanity, sometimes as opponents, and they have not always been particularly smart about this, because even as they are understandable. I mean, I watched the original Randy challenge roll out, for example, and I actually had the privilege of watching the reaction of many esotericists back then. And that was mostly to read the terms and conditions and go, okay, so you guys retain all the rights to whatever we find here. So basically, no matter what we show, you guys get to decide what gets printed. We're not going. And I've done a little bit of work on the history of sort of skeptical societies, on the collaborations between magicians, as in career magicians, the people who do magic shows, and the skeptics, and the sort of difficulties they had. And I always found the skeptics, on one hand, very sympathetic, in the sense that, I mean, Randy's story is basically heartbreaking. Imagine doing a show, and after that show, people come up to you and say, look, I know you're pretending to know magic. I know you're pretending, but please, I need to talk to this dead person. Please, I'm never going to tell anybody. You can do this. And this is because really of esoteric narratives. That's just plain heartbreaking. But also, a lot of the time, I found skeptical societies to sort of stray into esotericism themselves. I mean, the most classic example currently is Zitkovsky and his whole, everything that the Miri Institute does around AI, which is on one hand in part taken seriously by people in the field, but not by very many. But really, the way they act is a lot more characteristic of an esoteric current than really of an academic environment. Or, for example, the latest scandal with the Zizians and their whole sort of ways of self-improvement. And my initial suspicion really was aimed at the fact that, a lot of the time, people who think that they're rational are actually, they can't entertain the thought of being irrational, and this makes them ironically often as irrational and not, if not more than actual believers.
Overconfidence in being rational, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. And it's without understanding those limits. Yeah, and you managed to come in and go, well, I never knew that the people were actually studying these things. And I'm like, yeah, we were studying you guys 10 years ago. So yeah.
Okay, so maybe in some years our organization will be at the in some research in some ways when we become like esoteric group or something like that. So
or researchers yourselves, you never know.
yeah. So I just want to name some background of yours for our listeners to understand to whom I'm talking with. So Kateryna Zorya finished her PhD in the study of religion at Södertörn University. Her main research interests are the history of magic, occultism, and esotericism, as well as a general theory of religion and method. Now she's working at the Swedish Defense University. So the first question, maybe shortly, why at all esotericism? Why not Paul's letters or something like that?
So the thing is, I mean, like many people in the field, when I was a kid, I was trying to figure out how the world works, and I came across a book about magic. So and what I found was basically that no matter whether it worked or not, I mean, it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out what was actually real about this and what wasn't. And most of it isn't. Mostly it's psychology, I mean, as you guys well understand. But how do we say this? I also found an incredibly rich field of things that were happening. A history that was concerned both science and religion and the general development of humanity. And nobody was really interested in it because people associated with charlatans and with people who were just too stupid to know any better. And that was not the case. That was never the case. So by the time I came to university, really, 16, 17, I already knew that I wanted to work on the history of magic. And the thing is, that was about the time when the field itself was getting codified in Amsterdam, when people actually got together, got the money to have a department, and began actually doing conferences and things like that. So I actually came in at a very good time, right as people started talking to each other. So, and that enabled me to actually pursue a career in the history of magic.
Okay. Swedish Defense University. So you are defending from esoterics?
No,
Sweden.
No. That's tied mostly to Russia. I'm sorry. That's very mundane and banal because I actually the full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened a year before I had to finish my thesis. You can imagine the state I was finishing my thesis in. But as I did that, I started working a lot on volunteering and on wartime stuff. And it's surprisingly close to many of these topics because the history of Soviet esotericism specifically is tied a lot to Russian imperialism, unfortunately. So I actually had a decent enough background to go into this sort of thing. And I mean, for now, I mean, it's like in the video game, objective survive. So I continue working on my history of magic stuff. As I said, I'm actually on my way back to Sweden from Kiev right now. And I actually had the field outing to collect more materials for a little bit. I actually found some interesting stuff, which you guys, I'm guessing, are going to get to hear first about geography and so on.
Okay.
But that's a little bit on the back burner right now, as we're sort of trying to figure out how to make sure Europe doesn't die, all of it. So right now my academic work is geared towards that, even though I continue working in the history of religion.
Thank you, Kateryna. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
So the gist of this interview is your PhD work, your book, as I could say, which you recommended to read and offered for me after our meeting at ESFE. I read it and I just simply was blown away. not maybe in terms, of groundbreakingness, of methods chosen, of richness of data and richness of cases, but overall arching like sociological and political structure, which I've seen in your paper or book, which I don't know, align like a shadow on my research about Alatra and creative society. So I did that research and I caught myself several times, but maybe I'm too skeptical towards Russians, toward Russian esotericism. So I want to Russia to fail, Ukraine to succeed. So good thing would be to blame everything, on Russia. So everything, So I was almost paranoid, if I am right about that thing, And in terms of influences, in terms of publishing, in terms of how esoterics describe themselves, how we act, how we operate, your theoretical and empirical research on that aligned top notch on what I did with Alatra and creative society. So in that way, I was blown up. And your work is called "The Government Used to Hide the Truth, but Now We Can Speak: Contemporary Esotericism in Ukraine through 1968 to 2014." Sounds very esoteric. The name. So, okay, contemporary esotericism in Ukraine. So the timing is before the Soviet Union collapsed and after collapsed, before Maidan. Yeah, so the timing is. You just to go into that, into that topic, you are using the term anomie a lot of in your work, and it's like a term which I think is bringing in the topic, in the field, to understand what is happening and what you are researching there. What is anomie and how it corresponds to your work, and that's the portion of time which is in the title.
All right. So first of all, let me say that it's incredibly gratifying to get the feedback that you recognize all of these things. I mean, I recognize also this whole, am I being too biased here? And then, you haven't really done a PhD in the humanities unless you spent some time staring into a wall, looking at the horrors of history. That's just not going to get done, no matter what you study. Somehow, this is the humanities experience. But I'm definitely biased as a Ukrainian here. But also, once you've seen things, you can't really. Well, these are the conclusions they came to as in the most objective manner that I could, and for now I stand by them, and I'm very gratified to see that they've helped you sort of in your own work. But to the question at hand, anomie is a Durkheimian term, and it basically describes the state of what happens after white society-wide crisis, collapses, which erode structures in society and social networks and trust. And the idea is that there's a connection between social networks, trust, and sort of social structures, the big ones, and the ability to actually act. Because, to explain in very simple terms, you have to know that if you go to the store, you're going to be able to buy something. If you're going to the doctor, there's going to be a doctor and they're going to have medication. If you vote, then potentially you're going to have a new government. These sorts of things. You can't personally check all the structures that work. So to act, you have to have an understanding of these structures and being able to act upon them. And the thing is, the theory of anomie is that anomic disarray should create a paralyzing effect on society. So society, after some sort of wide-scale social shakeup, people are just sitting there sort of, what are we supposed to do now? I don't know what to do at all. And the thing is, Ukraine right now is the site for research for many, many interesting things, and also in the post-2014 context, because according to classical sociological theory, societies which have a low level of trust in general don't have high levels of civil activity and social activism because, okay, so if you're not trusting your neighbor to do things, why would you help them? There's no reason to.
Yeah.
And Ukraine, not only Ukraine has actually shown unprecedented levels of volunteering, unprecedented levels of civil involvement, especially post the big escalation, but also before that. I mean, the escalation was preceded by 2014. The attack on 2014 was preceded by the Maidan. 2014 Maidan was preceded by the Orange Revolution of 2004. That was preceded by many, many other sort of smaller upheavals, the Revolution on Granite, and of course the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so the importance of anomie to my thesis is really that, in a way, anomie doesn't necessarily paralyze a society, but what it does is it creates this openness to weird decisions and one can say the ability to pivot. If you haven't found something here, you're going to check very, very weird and outlying things. The normal things don't work, but then there's an array of things that are sort of subnormal or below normal, things that like if you're stable, if you're in a stable society with good doctors, you're not going to go look for a healer. Why would you? There is no need.
So then huge uncertainties comes. You pick whatever you have at hand to
Yes.
Get rid of that, and whatever is at hand, it works. Yeah, if it's, I don't know, so-called mainstream things or fringe
it doesn't
behaviors,
matter.
whatever. Yeah, if it works, it works.
Yeah, basically the key point of anomie is keep moving. As long as people, and that was one of the big things I was looking at in my thesis, that most people who are involved in magical practices, they keep moving, they don't give up. This didn't work, okay, I'll do a ritual in the stone and I won't give up. I'll just keep going, keep trying, keep waiting for an opportunity.
Maybe like a psychological survival in some sense. You just need some kind of motivations, explanations, just to go ahead.
To keep looking. Okay, say you've got somebody that's sort of let's say you've got somebody that can't find a job. You can't find a job, nothing's working. Magic gives you an explanation. Okay, maybe you were cursed, maybe you can do this little thing, and then you go and try again. This gives you this sort of, it prolongs the time you have before giving up on something. Usually it gives you an explanation. That explanation might be wrong, but it will lead you to continue to act.
But how do you look at that? Would you call that only the Soviet breakdown was the anomie time, or there were multiple episodes of anomie because of Maidan, in escalation of invasion? And what do you think about in terms of anomie about current war, like fully escalated war between Russia and Ukraine? That the same thing would apply and have a new wave of anomie, which will influence different behaviors?
In the sense that since anomie was one of the major theories for the Ukrainian context, we actually have very good sociological measurements of anomie throughout the years of independence. And the thing is, it never really fell. So, like, you have this about 70, 80%.
You said it never really fell?
Yes. So you never really had waves. It was just continuously high throughout most of independence. Like you'd have social questions and social questionnaires that would ask, okay, do you actually trust people? Would you say that it was true that things are so uncertain that you can't really trust anybody? And you'd consistently get 70, 80% across all age groups.
How do how you experience that as a Ukrainian? How do you feel about that?
It's an interesting thing, because I remember very clearly when I first moved to Western Europe, and you know what the biggest shock for me was? I first moved to the Netherlands for my master's degree, and this was the idea that people could schedule a meeting half a year in advance, and then they'd show up for it without reminders. Prepared. Half a year in advance, people would just schedule a meeting and then they would show up for it. And I was like, half a year? That's impossible. And I remember very clearly that by 2014, for most of my working life, I mean, the maximum planning horizon was like 3 or 4 months. And then by 2014, things very, very slowly started going up to a year. And, it was very slow and very tentative. Let's make plans for a year in advance. Wow, these plans have worked. We actually did a thing a year in advance. This is amazing. And then all of that, of course, collapsed into the very short term. The Russian invasion of 2014 and the Russian invasion of 2022 did basically the same thing. They collapsed the timelines back to first a few days, because you have no idea what's going to happen after these few days, then to a few months. Right now, you also have the situation where on the one hand, you have people, people have gotten used to it. So people do have like long-term plans, calendars, events for like a few months, some even for a year, especially for big things. But also, I think the main planning horizon remains within a year right now for Ukraine.
Yeah,
because
it looks like it's never-ending waves, because the first war, which was more troop-based, it looked like it was exhausted. Then the drones came, like another wave. Now the geopolitical decisions are very uncertain because of military support from USA. It's very unstable. So there's like every couple of months there are new news which are very unpredictable, and you don't see the ending of that.
I mean, Ukraine's policy can really be described as that old joke about asking somebody if you're going to meet a dinosaur in the street. What are the odds of meeting a dinosaur if you walk out onto the street? And the answer is 50-50. Either I'm going to meet one or I'm not. And this is very much what it feels to live like in Ukraine right now, because, people sort of handle this uncertainty by acting on what they have in front of them very much, not making plans too far out in advance, but also doing that to an extent, to the minimal operational extent, always keeping in the back of their heads that something might fall through. Okay, so people make too many plans. People, again, it's interesting about magic, coming back to that. I've actually found an interesting thing that there is a sort of dip in the study, in the use of magic. People don't use it that much during like the height of a crisis. Like, if they're under fire right now, most people aren't going to be using magic unless it's like something like, okay, protect
it's
me
like
from
a flight and fight response. You have to deal with things now, and after that probably have some kind of psychological relief in some ways. Yeah.
So people people do a lot of sort of magical work in preparation for something, often like protection spells or dreams. Sometimes they get esoteric experiences in the middle of something. Like, it was really funny. I was talking to my hairdresser about a year ago, and she was like, well, and then, of course, because I don't know, because everybody does magic in the former Soviet Union, she turned out to be part of some sort of witchy group, and they were talking about the dream work they were doing during the siege of Kiev. No, but they weren't under fire exactly at that sort of moment. And she was saying, okay, yeah, I'm not going anywhere because you get to see this old dragon that Kiev is waking up, and you've been having these dreams. So no, we have to stay and sort of reinforce it.
Mm-hmm.
And then during the main crisis, most people who aren't, I don't know, the only spells I could think of that would probably be useful is like personal protection spells. But mostly people don't really do complicated magical work. And then once the crisis is done, people start reconceptualizing it in magical terms. Like, okay, so what happened now? So there's a bit of
who's to blame? Yeah. What is my part in that? Yeah.
Yeah, not necessarily even who is to blame. I mean, in our case, it's pretty obvious, but very much, okay, but what is going on a bigger level? Sort of, what is the story we're telling ourselves?
What the universe is telling. You mentioned one phrase. in Soviet Union, everyone was doing magic. So let's split our interview in two parts. Let's talk about the Soviet Union and Ukraine, and how esotericism landscape looked like. And then later, let's go to the post-anomie time, and how esotericism developed in that. So let's talk about Soviet Union. Describe the landscape of esotericism broadly for our listeners.
So this is actually a very funny story again, because I was expecting to write a thesis on post-Soviet magic. I was not expecting for this to turn into a thesis that we went back to the Soviet Union half the goddamn time. Because I cannot overstate how little I was interested in Soviet history back when I was sort of studying.
Yeah, fuck it,
yeah, fuck it. Why I'm interested in magic? Why would I be interested in the history of an atheist state? And then you dig up a source, you trace the source one step back, you find a Soviet source. You dig up a second source, you trace the source one step back, you find a Soviet source. And that, basically, I had a corpus of about 450 books and something like that. And that happened nearly every time. At this point, I realized that I was not escaping this, and I began to look at it in more detail.
Kateryna, so I want to respond to that. The same thing which I told to you, that almost schizophrenia of mine about Russian influence everywhere, and especially in esoteric fields and waves. So I was like almost paranoid, because each time I found some kind of practicing practitioner of esoteric, some kind of scientific thing, some kind of a device which opens up chakras and, calculate something. I go a couple of steps, where it was manufactured, what ideas it's based from. You look for translation, and you found some kind of Ivan Petrov in St. Petersburg, in some kind of universities, institute of, some kind of bullshit, university looks like, okay, some kind of bullshit institute. And I was like, I am paranoid, this is not true.
Am I going crazy over the world?
It cannot happen. Every time I found some bullshit in Lithuania, I found some dude which was, in 87 or something like that, released stream of books in the institute of whatever shit it is, so it is what you are describing in some ways?
It is, yes. This is slightly later in the timeline, but yeah, this is a consequence of what I found. And this is actually one of the things that I think is possibly the most important to talk about on the Skeptical podcast, specifically because, broadly, the movements of the research community and the skeptical community are aligned. We want people to follow good research in their lives. We want them to sort of have an actual understanding of the world, universe they live in, right? We don't want them to live life scientifically in a way. And the thing is, we already have a big experiment in actually doing that, and really in doing that honestly. Because the early Soviet Union actually did try this on an unprecedented scale in size. And they fucked up. I'm sorry for the swearing, but I don't...
Yeah, it's okay. Swear as much as you want. What do you say? Fantastic. We're trying. Trying what?
They were trying indeed to do a scientifically based government. And it backfired. It backfired immensely. And I am perhaps... if I have a sort of opinion as an academic, and that is that we need to study this big experiment to see how it backfired exactly. Because it was as a consequence of their policy on science and education that we have the current burst of esotericism that we see right now in former Soviet countries. And its specific form, its specific pseudo-scientific form, is really because of what the Soviet Union was trying to do, both very early, from the 20s, 30s, and also later, post-World War II. And the thing is, the Soviet Union had what did it have? It had massive land resources, it had massive resources of people who didn't really speak the same language, both in the strict sense, but also in the academic sense, people who came from very different backgrounds. And what they wanted to do, they wanted to push forward a scientific revolution as fast as possible. And they wanted to modernize as fast as possible, industrialize as fast as possible. And what they did actually two very interesting streams. And, possibly one of the things that made me, stare at the wall for the longest and going, I thought this was a good idea. I mean, if you'd asked me before doing my PhD what sort of thing I would have done in an idealized society, I would have probably said these same things. And I had no idea that they were sort of Soviet things that I'd absorbed from my background as somebody born in the very late years of the Soviet Union. But here I am. Here's people who have tried these very things, and this is what they got. And what they got was not anywhere near what I predicted. So step one, you have a huge amount of natural resources, but you don't know where they are. You don't know where the geological things are. You don't know where the useful plants and animals are. But who knows? The people who live here know. So you put together your committees of academics or people who you can train into being academics. That's a separate pain point, because most academics are actually not exactly on your side. They have opinions about you, and that's a problem.
We are not like a material to be trained. Yeah,
exactly. We're not material to be trained. You have to listen to us. We're the experts. And you're like, well, we need you to do things. And they
we
were like,
will train you.
Yeah, exactly. And what happens is they want to figure out, okay, so, but what here, in all of this sort of folk knowledge, there's got to be something useful here, because all of science comes from people observing, seeing things for a little while, and, picking stuff up. So if we do an organized collection of this folk knowledge, we can find useful medicines, we can find metals, we can observe strange natural phenomena and make use of them. We can make discoveries the same way that people in the 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th, and earlier centuries did. So what they do is they go out to people and say, we want your folk knowledge. We want what you know is true about your environment. And it's a very good idea on paper, right? Because, how else are you going to do this? If you start from scratch, you lose time. You lose decades of time, really. If you just stand in people who have no familiarity with local things, you lose decades of time and possibly.
And Russia is big, also.
Yeah, exactly. It's impossible. You have to rely on local knowledge. So that's one part. Let's put it aside for now. The second part is that the Soviet Union is at the same time trying to do external policy. And that external policy involves positioning itself as the main, biggest progressive force in the world, including in science. Which means that what they want a history of science that's clean and nice, that tells people that we are the people who have, from the very beginning of humanity, we have followed the best of what humanity has to offer. We are the inheritors of the Greek philosophers, of the Arabic mathematicians, of the Renaissance, of the Renaissance humanists, of the Enlightenment, and of the early scientists. We are the people who have always stood on the side of light against the darkness of the churches, of everything regressive, and so on. But the problem is that the history, even of European science, not to mention Asia, Africa, the Americas, it is a mess. The church, none of us like the institution, but historically speaking, it played an immense role in the spread of scientific material. You had people belonging to church institutions. You had it sponsoring people. You had situations like, Giordano Bruno did not get burned for his science. He got burned because he was an asshole to basically everybody and pissed off pretty much everybody he met. This sort of thing. Basically, the problem is that you can't really do a history of European science while throwing out the church. But the Soviet Union wants to do that because they see the church as an opponent. So what do? they find a trail of thought that they could vaguely construe as skeptical, and that is Arabic philosophy. That was one thing that surprised me immensely when I came to
Arabic philosophy.
Yes.
This point which you are mentioning, that the influence, like a taking, almost artificially taking the influence of Arabic philosophy, is it like a new step, or for like you are as a scientist, it's everybody knows that this thing happened? Yeah.
This is actually fascinating, because this was something that surprised me when I went to Western University. I was like, what do you mean you don't know Al-Ghazali, Al-Kindi, Averroes? Okay, you know Averroes, but you don't really know that that's Ibn Rushd. You don't know Avicenna. Why don't you know that? They were instrumental. And it's true. They were. So for all of the Soviet Union's fault, the fact that Western Europe also had its own politicking going on. And they were very much trying to forget the impact of Arabic philosophy at one point, even though it was there very much. I mean, the entire South Europe, even if it was in conversation with the Arabians, they were the ones that after sort of Greek civilization went into decline. Imagine me doing scare quotes, because this is a gross oversimplification. But in a way, for a very long time, before the Middle Ages, and after, in the 4th, 5th centuries, the Arabic world was the center of what we call proto-scientific learning. You'd have medicine, you'd have astronomy, you have great many things going on. And they were the ones who preserved the sort of Greek materials, Aristotle specifically. And it was through the Arabic countries that all of this went back to Europe later. Their role is immense, known to specialists and has been known to specialists for ages, but it does get left out of the Western European narrative, because indeed there was a fight between the sort of church history strain, specifically the Thomas Aquinas strain, and the Averroesian strain. And the thing is, and that fight went on like it was a Renaissance fight and an early Enlightenment fight. And the thing is, the Soviet historians picked up on that. And they said, okay, if you guys are sort of taking that out of your story, we're going to take it in, especially since the Arabic world is also linked with Central Asia. And then we can say that here, these are our philosophers, and yeah. And this is sort of the true line. And it's hilarious, because at this point, what happens is one thing that they didn't predict, and that was that natural magic was thrown into this Arabic line by Western European philosophers. So when they said, all right, everybody that's ever been accused of being an Averroist is a true scientist and a friend of humanity, they got every single Renaissance magician into this whole thing, into their sort of narrative of proto-science.
Okay. So that's in some ways, maybe, it's an oversimplification, but in some ways that's how that magical stuff, philosophy of magic and rituals come into the broader landscape of ideas in Soviet Union.
Yeah, and the fun part is that they were very constrained by what Lenin said and what Stalin said, and you could not. The most shocking thing for me here was that you couldn't have a biography of Aristotle or Plato, because there were some critical remarks that Lenin made about them. But you could have Giordano Bruno, who they said was a pantheistic materialist. Yeah, a little bit confused, but he's got the spirit, the hypothesis of many worlds. And the fact that you can have this biography of a guy that believed in aliens, in multiple worlds, in absolutely insane stuff by Renaissance measures. You could have that in the Soviet Union, have him as this sort of spirit of scientific inquiry, as well as many other people. Agrippa, Faustus, Nostradamus was presented in my books as my childhood books as a scientist who did optics, and it was the sort of stupid nobles who portrayed him as this astrologer and diviner, and he just wanted to do optical experiments. Literally everybody, every single magician, alchemist, got sort of co-opted into the Soviet narrative.
Oh yeah.
So on one hand, you have these people that you have this mandate that people who have never heard about the sort of history of science before, they go to school And they get told two things. First of all, the things you already know are pretty valuable. Second, look at these people who came before you and use them as examples of standing up for science against a dark
What was that the transmission? Just literature was translated and just poured in?
Yes, absolutely. You had immense access to Giordano Bruno, Lorenzo Valla, Della Porta's Natural Magic. Again, there was the biography of Agrippa. One of my favorite informants actually wound up going to herbalism because he had access to 10 volumes of Avicenna or something, you've even seen that, and he wanted to be a medic, like his favorite Arabic philosopher. And because of that, he went studying. He started out with studying herbalism because he was a kid that was like in the 8th or 9th grade or something, and he wanted to be like his favorite medieval scientist. I mean, in a way, this is the sort of thing all sorts of scientific sort of popular science tries to do. You want to tell people about the cool people who came before you and inspire the kids to do the same thing.
You need those historical roots, to legitimize your position in the future, and to construct the historical narrative, how we came about to this point and how we can proceed. So in your work, Maybe you didn't finish the point.
No, I mean, what I was saying was that anybody who comes in sees an interesting thing. They see magic given to them from above as part of the university program, as an example of how science is done. Yeah. And then they get told to take a look at their own folk practices, a lot of which involve magic from below, and examine them and tell us what works. Tell us what part of this magic we can make into science. And you have people who are in the best of faith. That's what they're going to try to do. They might not be competent at it, but they are going to try to make their lived experiences into science. And it's a much more complicated process than,
Okay. In your work, you are separating practicing esoterics in two segments. They are working class and intellectuals. So you are talking about the influx of ideas and which class and at what time these ideas influenced those two categories of esoterics, and how that new generation of esoterics were born, because esoterics were before those ideas came into the place. Some ideas maybe were replaced, indoctrination, whatever. How the new esoteric wave emerged from these, and how these two categories do play the role.
Right. So the people we've been talking about until now are exactly what I've termed working class esotericists. So these are people who may have inherited some sort of magical practice from their daily life in their village or small city, that have bought entirely into the Soviet system of education, that make an honest attempt of doing just that. We're told that these practices that used to be called magic are actually proto-science, and that we are smart enough to make them into regular science. That's what we're doing. And they take it absolutely at face value. And they try. They do their best. Intellectual class esotericists are a bit of a different story, in the sense that they're the people who came from sort of existing intellectual groups pre-Soviet Union. So in many cases it was Russian Empire or local elites. And they're different in the sense that, for one, they had a laundry list of questions toward the Soviet Union and about what they're doing. And in a sense, they were brought up, the Soviet Union sort of tried to make them train replacements from, proper new Soviet scientists. So in the 20s and 30s, there's a very demonstrative play called Fear by Afinogenov. Now, it was a Russian playwright, and it's basically a play about this professor who gets saddled with a grad student that's had maybe 5 years of education. Now they're trying to make him do, graduate student level work, because we're Soviet people, we can do this. And Afinogenov himself winds up getting repressed. And there's a very interesting exploration of his diaries that talk about how he, after getting repressed, goes, okay, but if I'm getting repressed, that means I have not lived up to the Soviet ideal. I must do better.
Mm.
And in a very real way, the early Soviet intellectuals are people who, some of them believed in Soviet ideals and also tried to do better by them. Many of them were skeptical of them, and many of them got killed or repressed for their troubles. These are people who also inherited 19th century esoteric ideas. And in our case, that means a lot of ritual magic, a lot of spiritualism. But also, unlike the working class esotericists, these were people whom bitter experiences taught, no, we're not trying to drag humanity along. Shut up and do your work quietly. The Soviet Union is an
Please
empire
elaborate
of
on that. I didn't understand.
So
What way are trying to do differently?
So they were trying to survive, basically, because in a way the Soviet Union said, you are going to train us a new generation of intellectuals, and then you're not needed anymore.
So it's the thing which was everywhere in Soviet Union. Intellectuals are the material to the machine, but also the biggest threat to the machine.
Right,
so,
exactly.
If you are as intellectual, you are always on the spot, more than just simple labor man, and your bad move can get you into trouble way quicker and with more consequences. Yeah,
exactly. And you have people like Nalimov, who is the father of sort of bibliometrics and of citation indexes. You have people like Danil Andreev, who wrote the roads of the world. I mean, that one is heartbreaking if you read it. You read it and it opens up with, I wrote this in solitary confinement where the Soviet government threw me in, and if I were thrown in earlier, I would have been shot. But now I managed to survive, and maybe I have a few years left to publish this. And then he goes stuff. Okay, but then there's and then let me give you a sacred geography of the world that has people that are in between centaurs, angels of darkness, but most of all, they resemble flying dinosaurs. And you're like, I understand what you were going through here. I mean, I get it, but that does not make it any easier. And the thing is, these people had this ethos of, we're going to work in small, unnoticeable positions, like the generation of street sweepers and night guards. We're going to work in institutions that give us access to books. We're going to do translations. We're going to hide behind very quality, very technical work that has absolutely no chance of getting us arrested or killed. If anybody asks us if we know something, no, we don't. We know how to evade the KGB because the KGB is stupid. We will create and reproduce libraries. We are here as preservers of the material, not even so much as practitioners. We're not trying to change the world. We're trying to save what's really important and sort of stay alive under what they perceived as, well, you could really probably say as an empire of darkness. Yeah. Even though many early intellectuals were pro-Soviet and actually tried, but also, I mean, it's a very complicated thing. Many people started out as Soviet and became anti-Soviet. Many people started out Soviet and said, okay, but the Soviet Union has failed our ideals and we have to do things ourselves and so on. So in a way, in comparison to working class esotericists who just went, okay, we're making things better for all of humanity, you have these people who are, nobody's making things better for anybody. If we're lucky, we get to save a few things and teach the next generation, if we're lucky. And the thing is that's interesting is because that they're characterized by the same sort of syncretism. Because when you're in this state of pressure, in this sort of pressure cooker, you don't really choose which books you get to keep. Everything that the government dislikes is valuable because you don't really have the capacity to critically analyze these sources, sort them, and so on. So you have people, very strange bedfellows. You have scientists alongside religion, because I mean, take a look at the geneticists and the cyberneticists and the repressions they got for absolute bureaucratic reasons, alongside Christianity and esotericism, really properly. And it doesn't really matter to them because if the Soviet government doesn't like it, that means there's got to be something of value. We're going to have to preserve this. We don't have anything else. So you have these networks of people who reproduce things and copy things, and who are incredibly suspicious of anybody that comes in, to talk to them. I remember when I started my PhD, I wasn't sure back then if I were allowed to do interviews, but I was sort of talking to people and asking, okay, if I do get the chance to do interviews, can I talk to you? And one of the dudes I got into because his wife worked at the publishing house, which I was familiar with. And she said, okay, I'll talk to my husband who actually did samizdat things in the 60s and 70s. And then she says, okay, you can come to our house, meet, we can talk about things. And I come in, and then he looks at me and goes, okay, so I was thinking you were some sort of secret police agent. And this is the 2000s. This is like 2020 or something. I was thinking you were maybe a secret police agent, but your query arrived on the night of the full moon. And I think that's a valuable enough sign that I can try talking to you. And then we spent the next hour with him sort of, poking at me and trying to figure out if I really was a Secret Services agent. And the next 3 hours, info dumping at me. Okay, you have to know this, this, and this. This was important.
So you was after the trust was built, you was poured with information. Yeah.
Yeah. He didn't particularly care what I wanted to know. He cared, okay, this is the important shit that you need to know. This is what I've been saving, preserving, and so on. Here you go.
So, Kateryna, this is my hypothesis. You can, tear it down and put in a trash bin, or agree. We'll see. So, as I would expect, that working class esoterics, which were practicing more or less esotericism in maybe more smaller towns or rural areas, which got some kind of attention and was used as a source, as a human resource. A lot of them were brought into the bigger cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the ratio between maybe practicing academics, but more, I don't know how to say, not in too fringe ideas or not as eclectical, the ratio was changed. And suddenly there are a lot of people from rural areas with those new knowledge and new history of philosophy and new new chances for their career, and new research was being done. How would you describe that? I don't know, part in time, how it looked like, and how that changed the field of esotericism.
This is definitely true, but I'd like to say that this is probably the 20s to early 40s, and because after World War II, you had the next generation that grew up out of this animosity. The old style intellectuals and their transfers, the new style intellectuals had made up to high academic positions, even whether or not they were qualified. At this point, there was nobody else. And everybody in the 50s and 60s were people who got taught these things, people who got taught these things in this mix, right? And so by now, by the late Soviet Union, you really no longer have so sharp a distinction. You have people who lean more towards one or the other side of the spectrum, but not like as cleanly typed as later. But yeah, you're right that the ratio absolutely changed. I would honestly love to do a thing someday where I take a look in more detail on how it changed, because I can see it going different ways. I can see in some places people being absolutely overwhelmed, and in some cases you would have fewer of them and you'd count on sort of the old style intellectuals to teach them. But that would still change the ratio, because if you don't get to pick your own apprentices, you also don't get to pick your teaching methods, because they will not know quite as many things as you need them to teach them. So I can't say I know exactly how that went, but you're right in that it changed absolutely. It's just a separate book.
For one question, let's stay on the Soviet period. Not only Soviet Union, but all around the world. But in some
Mhm.
in some cases, as I see that and I have some knowledge. The religion, new age movements, esoteric practicing groups of persons were how to say, used and persecuted in interchangeably at times, and when the government needed it as a resource,
Mhm.
it used it, and if it wasn't needed, it was persecuted and discarded.
Yeah.
How you could describe the of especially esoterics?
So the thing is with esoterics is that very much it was mostly for anti-Soviet activity, for spreading anti-Soviet ideas or dissident ideas or bourgeois ideas, in the sense that a lot of them were, academia thrives on international communication. You have to be able to collaborate with colleagues no matter where they are. And of course, the Soviet Union had both its periods of greater openness, but also its periods of xenophobia and this instability in external policy. I have a favorite book on that, Terry Martin, The Affirmative Action Empire, that describes all this in the early Soviet Union in great detail. And this oscillation between, okay, we're letting you collaborate with people outside the Soviet Union, now we're persecuting you for it. That really got many esotericists as well, I think. And they weren't normally prosecuted for being religious or esoteric. No, they were more prosecuted for like anti-Soviet or dissident activity.
Some kind of esoteric practices or ideas weren't like like it's crossing the red line. We will not accept that happening in Soviet Union, and we have to shut it down.
The thing is, for that sort of persecution, you want the bigger groups. You want, first of all, Christianity, because the thing is, it's a bit of a complex thing, but the Soviet Union tried to take control of the bigger religions. And the idea was that they'd let like one big religion per region, they control its bishops, mullahs, or whatever it is, so that any sort of anti-Soviet sentiment that you can have, it gets poured here, it gets caught by agents.
Okay, so in terms of esotericism, were there such groups which were on the brink of persecution or were actually persecuted in Soviet Union, which would be typically labeled as esoteric groups of movements, which were bigger, not like a single persons or something like that? Do you recall any?
I think that I can't look. I'm afraid to lie to you because I don't remember many off the top of my head. There were like ritual magic temples, I think, Freemasonry groups, because Freemasonry groups were often really political groups
and Christian related also.
Yeah, I mean, for example, my favorite example here are the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Scientologists. Everybody knows that if you want to test out the waters for persecuting religion, you start out with one of those groups. Jehovah's Witnesses, because they are anti-war they're pacifists. Nobody likes them. Everybody hates the people who go door to door and annoy you. So you can more or less try out repressions on them without repercussions because everybody says, okay, Jehovah's Witnesses, who cares? But what's important here is that they set a precedent for people going to the army, for example, and not fighting because they're pacifists. And this is why they're persecuted mostly. Scientologists, same thing, too annoying. Nobody likes them because they have because they're sort of bombastic about their cult-based stuff.
Okay, but Kateryna, so we have influx of ideas, influx of people, industrialization, new research, but the Soviet Union fell down, and that probably the biggest how to say, the wave of anomie happened. And we have those two groups, working class and intellectuals, how that period changed the landscape of esotericism in Ukraine in this case.
Yeah. So what happens here is that for a few years, you have the situation where Soviet resources and structures are still there, but the censorship no longer is. which means that people just go and print 100,000 copies of Papus because easy to get, because he was translated. Papus is the French esotericist from the 19th century, because he was translated into Russian 100 years ago. Easy to get, easy to publish. You have tons of paper that you want to use up, print 100,000 copies. And because it was forbidden, people bought them, very much so. And you had this insane publishing boom of basically everything that was forbidden, and that was why people were interested in it. But also, I mean, there's a reason I started a little bit earlier, before the fall of the Soviet Union, because despite the internal perception that, yeah, the Soviet Union is going to go on forever, in reality, the liberalization really started in the 1980s. You could have departments of religion talk about new religions and being skeptical towards the way Soviet propaganda worked with bigger and smaller religions and so on. And it's funny, but speaking of coming back a little bit to the skeptics and so on, one of the biggest sort of, at least in Ukraine, one of the biggest groups that sort of spread pro-esoteric sentiment was the Znania Society, Knowledge Society.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's very funny because, I mean, originally this was the Society of Militant Atheists, right? And how did they wind up spreading that? That's actually a topic of a separate paper that I want to do someday in detail, because I don't have enough access to archives. But it wound up that because they were sort of following that old Soviet style thinking of, yeah, we should do popular science that encourages kids to be interested, you know, in science and science fiction and so on. And it turned out that
strict scientific research is another thing. We have to do a pop science just to, you know, spread the ideology. Yeah,
we have to do strict stuff. Can be fun as well. So, for instance, Ukraine still has a UFO research group that's, I think, assigned to the Kiev Polytechnic University and meets at the planetarium, called Probe. I mean, you can't make this up. You have a UFO research group called Probe. And I think it's mostly men in their 70s and 80s who meet up and do reports on anomalous events that they've seen and like on new equipment that they've gotten. It's incredibly Soviet style. And they also grew up from Znania. And if you guys know the Great White Brotherhood, which I've mentioned, I mean, the man that sort of was behind it, Krivanogov, he was also a technical sciences candidate affiliated with Znania, for example, with the sort of pro-scientific popular science. And these things just wound up being very, very intertwined in the late Soviet Union, even before the fall. And the thing is, the fact that these structures, the popular science structures, were already there, people were already doing publishing, even amateur publishing. What happened was that for them, the situation didn't really destabilize. It stabilized more because their future was always uncertain. They had no idea what was going to happen tomorrow, except now we might not go to jail for it. So
in some sense, for one group of people, it was like a terrible time, uncertainty at the highest level. For other people, it was like the best time.
Yeah, exactly. You wound up with a lot. It became just a lot easier to do things. That you could do things now with fewer problems. Yeah, sure, you could deal with stuff like, I don't know, gang violence or whatever, but I mean, that's nothing in comparison to state violence.
Okay. Just a sec. I will because I was too too involved. I didn't think about next question. Okay, so your work, the government used to hide the truth, but now we can speak. So it literally talks about that breakdown of Soviet Union, what we can speak. So how that oppression spread, you know, you also mentioned White Brotherhood case, and that because I know that even today, you will correct me if it's not correct, but as I see, even today there are a lot of religion persecution sentiments in Ukraine to persecute in some cases new age movements, and so that structure, mindset, or even politics of sorts, how it changed during the collapse, and how the public viewed that.
So the thing is, the funny part here is that Ukraine actually doesn't have that much of a persecution mindset, but this was actually a field of struggle between Russia and Ukraine, politically speaking. And I was incredibly surprised to find that, even though I grew up in it. I mean, one of my friends' mom was literally the judge at the Great White Brotherhood case. We had my older colleagues were working on that case and so on, but I really didn't understand anything about it until I did the PhD, even though I had something of a front row seat when I was much younger.
Mm.
So the thing is that, as I said a little earlier, Russia actually has a very similar model of using religions, and has had this model with some elaboration since the Russian Empire. Have one major religion to a region, control its major figures, and everybody that sort of wants to foment dissent and is of religious mindset, you catch them all in that sieve. So you promote one religion, one honeypot, you suppress everything else, and you make it easier for your agents to work on them. Ukraine, weirdly enough, had a policy to countermand that from the very beginning of its dissolution. I remember reading a very hilarious document that was basically, because what Russia did, they often sort of talked to parliamentaries and said, you have these dangerous cults. They are dangerous. You want to find out more about that? And then they asked for expert opinions from the Institute of Philosophy and other related institutions. And my favorite was a document which said, nobody gives a shit about the cults. What you want to ask is why the Russian Orthodox Church has agents here. The cults are fine, leave them alone. And the idea was that the sort of policy of people who did the study of religion was, all right, cults are dangerous, who cares? As long as there's a bunch of these structures, they're difficult to control from the outside. If we let one structure control them, that can be subdued by Russia. So you have this weird policy of religious plurality where nobody really cares which minor religion you're from. We didn't really have big persecutions. And the Great White Brotherhood case really had the potential to upturn all that, because they were incredibly hostile. And they were very much, okay, if you're in the hands of the police, they are demons, do not comply with anything. If you're a martyr, then you're a martyr, that sort of thing.
Mm.
Again, one of my professors at university was actually a rather young academic back in the day. She was working in the museum that the end got held at gunpoint by these guys trying to do a ritual back in the day, which may or may not have been a mass suicide, but that they never got around to it. But the point was that the Ukrainian policy has always been, if you find a crime, like an actual crime, like this dude held museum workers at gunpoint, arrest them for that crime. If you find embezzlement, if you find rape, if you find whatever else happens in them, prosecute them like you would any other organization that allows crime in its ranks. Religious crime is not exceptional crime. Cults are not exceptional institutions. And so long as they're not breaking laws, we don't care. And this was done really as a counterweight to this Russian policy of consolidation.
So it was done on purpose, yeah?
As far as I can understand, yes. I'm not exactly sure that my older colleagues would see it that way, but they definitely were aware of the Russian policy of consolidation, and they want to counteract it. I can't say that there was, a strategic document or a meeting of scholars of religion of Ukraine that said we need to promote cults, but they could see that Russia consolidated religions, and that an anti-Russian narrative include a plurality of religions. Also, because they could see how Russia worked with the American anti-cult narrative. There's the reason that Dworkin, the main anti-cultist, actually had very much he had collaborations with the American versions of the same. Mm-hmm. And there was a collaboration between sort of scholars of religion who opposed that also in Europe and in America. So this is really a bit of a global process. I cannot say that there was like a platform where, a plan of action, but it was more like, okay, they want this thing, we gotta make sure that it's hard for them to get.
Okay.
We take a stand.
Yeah, in your work, you put a lot of emphasis on publishing, on publishing infrastructure, on different regions. Did I get it right that infrastructure, which you already mentioned, which was left after the Soviet Union, was as a technical industrial resource, especially maybe, I don't know, for those working class esoterics, not the intellectual ones. And as I understood, that was the fuel, the resource which was needed for those working class, for those ideas to be spread. And I didn't remember correctly that a lot of those printing presses were distributed in those eastern, southern parts of Ukraine, and that's why those ideas, esoteric ideas, are not evenly distributed in Ukraine. Put emphasis on geography and distribution of those ideas.
Absolutely. So first, with the intellectuals and working class, the working class people published their books. The intellectual class people made sure books got published. That would be the difference. Intellectual class people worked in presses, both academic and in the founding of specialized esoteric presses after the fall. Working class people wrote books. Often these books would be repetitions of one another. Like you have a person publishing 15 books, you read through the 15 books, and the material there is like 2 or 3 books, and the rest of it is basically rehashes. That all happened often. But yes, both of them played a role. And the thing is, the technical...
Kateryna, I didn't understand it clearly. So working class esoterics were copying each other's work and didn't pay too much attention on the, on the new ideas or something like that. It
Not
was
necessarily each other's work, but it was sometimes it was their own work. It was like, I have improved this book, and then you look at the book and it's 90% the same material, but the person has been working on it for the last 10 years, and it's like a person that hasn't been taught how to edit a book and stuff. Again, not really malicious, not an attempt to cheat somebody into buying the same book 5 times. More like this person did not get taught about how books are made, and they made a book anyway.
Yeah,
that sort of thing. Or somebody that was like doing a dictionary of magic and was like, this has been 10 years in which I have gathered all of these things, and then you wind up with, topics out of a Soviet children's encyclopedia occasionally and without a quote, and you're like, okay, dude, I get it. Intellectual class esotericists basically did a lot of the mechanics of publishing. Okay, so we're organizing a printing press, although you had working class esotericists do that too. We're translating something from Hindu or from Tibetan, that sort of thing. They were very much translators and editors rather than writers, and working class esotericists were writers.
Yeah.
So, and with the region-wise, the thing is, as you know, the Soviet, Ukraine got annexed in several steps by the Soviet Union, and Eastern Ukraine was Soviet a lot longer than Western Ukraine was, and it got the bulk of sort of development of these regional presses, material distribution, and so on. Western Ukraine put up more of a fight, and also was more religious, so they never really finished the process of dismantling the local presses to start building their own. So as a result, when I was looking at these books, I was amazed that it's kind of funny, this is the exclusive thing I mentioned in the beginning, because I was looking around at book markets for 5 years of my PhD, and I think the earliest I found was in 2014. And this time around, when I visited like a year and a half after finishing my PhD, I went to Lviv's book markets and actually found 5 or 6 books that were like from 2010, from 2012, And I was like, where were these books when I was doing the PhD? I had literally come to Ukraine every year looking for these books in the libraries and everywhere. And now I do take one walk through, through the book markets and I find 5 of them. Come on. So, but the interesting part was that the Western Ukrainian books which I found were actually they're earlier than what I thought. But again, none of them are before 2010, I think. But the thing is, they're also academic presses. And they're like stuff like Mykola Rudenko, who was a dissident and very much involved in the founding of independent Ukraine, apparently had some insane, pseudophysics that he published in relatively decent English. I actually showed it, and I have a colleague that started out as a physicist, but right now is a historian of the Inquisition and magic. And I showed it to him, and then was like, he's like, fantastic. His unit of measurement is 1 standard grape. And I'm like, and why does mass equal vacuum and things like that? This is like old school horrible science. And I'm like, yeah, this guy was not a physicist, but he was. But the point is that these were academic presses that either published people who worked at these institutes, like a psychologist that was doing, magical practices, or a dissident that was doing, crazy physics. So all of them were intellectual class publications. Like maybe not the highest sort of intellectual class, but all of them were intellectual class publications. So I'm going to be doing an updated analysis of that once I get a few weeks break from the current war project. But the point is that if you compare these things in reality, the East, South, and Center of Ukraine had an immeasurably larger web of publications. And the reason for that was that the Soviet Union had this interesting dynamic where the distribution networks were tended towards the center, so towards Moscow, towards Kiev, towards Minsk. But the censorship was a lot lesser in the fringes. Donetsk, Pskov, Gomel, Crimea. So you had a lot of stuff that was published over there, somewhere in the fringes. That got absorbed towards one of the centers, translated into a bigger regional language, pre-2014, usually Russian, because basically any Soviet language other than Russian just gets you that country. Russian gets you all of the former Soviet Union because of Russian policy. A very simple calculation. And most of the time, people really pre-2014, the borders for publishing were permeable. You'd have a book published, printed somewhere in Russia, then published in Ukraine. Printed somewhere in Ukraine, published in Russia. As far as I understand, that really depended, on stuff like the price of paper and whether somebody had a friend at the local publishing house. Really, there weren't any borders. But really, Western Ukraine did not get much of this publishing because they weren't part of this whole Soviet industrialization process, not nearly to the same extent as the center, east, and south of Ukraine was.
In your work, you put a lot of emphasis also on how those 2 classes represent themselves.
Oh, yeah.
How they talk about themselves, how they express their actual esoteric ideas, how they publish in terms of volume, etc. You touched on it a little bit about the translations and own works or copying. Elaborate on that, because that was fascinating, how they talk about themselves, about their abilities, and all that stuff.
So the thing is, the difference here really is that working class esotericists want to be seen as legitimate. They see themselves as providing an integral service to society, as pioneers, maybe misunderstood, yes, but the healers see themselves as people who will do what doctors cannot. Yeah, and they don't believe us, but my patients are suffering, and I, as a good person, I have the obligation to do this, even if nobody believes me. What they want is recognition, really, and being seen as these valuable members of society. Intellectual class esotericists don't want to be seen. That's it. They don't want to be recognized by anybody except people in the know. In a way.
And this applies also after the Soviet breakdown. Why?
Because, it takes a very long time for these things to go away. And nobody was, and I think this is where really the war comes in, because people start hiding again now that Russia's attempting to attack, because once if Russia on its occupied territories catches you doing stuff with weird religion, they will arrest you and torture you. I had a colleague named Kozlovsky, and he was a historian of religion first and foremost, and involved in studying Protestantism and stuff like that. He stayed in occupied Donetsk because he had a disabled son, wound up in Russian prison for like a couple of years before he was traded away. Died from complications a few years later of the torture and stuff like that. And the thing is, because with Russia, where Russia and the Soviet Union were concerned, being involved with this stuff was dangerous. And but the difference here really was that for working class esotericists, they're like, okay, the Soviet Union didn't listen to us, but maybe new people will. And for intellectuals surviving the collapse, we don't know how long this is going to last. A lot of them did go more public, except that they're more public involved like the sort of eliteness in a way. Like if you take somebody that's providing magical services to the public that's working class, they're going to go, okay, I'm going to help as many people as I can. Yes, if that means 40 people, seeing 40 people a day on a very tight schedule, having to, they're basically trying to recreate a free medical Soviet clinic. Yeah, I'm overworked, but I have to help people. And the intellectual class people will say, you cannot help 40 people a day. That is not helping. You're not actually doing a good job. Yeah, we're going to take a lot of money, but we're actually going to dedicate time and expertise, and we're going to do a proper diagnostic, and we're going to do the work. Like, both of them accuse each other of immense unprofessionalism. But what that unprofessionalism looks like is very different. Yeah, so the working class esotericists say, you're not even doing magic, not really, because look at that. You have a patient with a curse, and what are you going to do? Are you going to read tarot with them? Come on. You've never practiced magic in your life. You're armchair magicians. And the intellectual class esotericists are going to say, yeah, you're just taking money from people. They walk in, you read something over them, and you say, next. You're not even looking at them properly. So it's really very much an interfield feud about what is effective magic and how magic should be done. It's fascinating because on one hand, intellectual class esotericists don't want recognition. On the other hand, there is a current, they do, like every single esotericist, they do want to have a criteria of what makes them, how do you know a practitioner is good? And well, for working class esotericists, it's how many people you've helped, how effective your magic is. For intellectual class esotericists, it's often how together your life is. There's this widespread belief that magical practice will challenge you, as in you might wind up with, in some initiatory groups, there's a saying that once you've signed the paper that says that you want to do the next initiation, not even once you go through the ritual, once you've signed the paper that says, I am doing this, your life starts going to shit in an initiatory specific way. So, like, okay, you have unlocked the next difficulty level, and what you have to do is, your task is to stabilize yourself, and you have to live a good life. You have to be independent. You have to be financially dependent. I remember it's common intellectual class rhetoric was that I'm not taking any student that can't pay for their training themselves. You cannot take money from your parents. You cannot take money from your family. You have to be able to earn that money and to dedicate the money and time. So it's very much it's this placement of emphasis on personal competence, and if you're good at your life, then you're a good witch. It's very interesting.
So for you to see those differences, you had to look at those works directly.
Yeah.
At what we are saying. What do you think? It will be overarching question, maybe very broad, but I don't know, react and respond in what way you see it, fit, and for yourself to not be bullshitting, and saying what you don't know. But broadly speaking, how would you say those ideas in such a sheer volume influenced Ukrainian society? In what ways did it solve anomie? Did it help people to find good vectors of living their ways, or they are I don't know, misguided for 50 or 100 years up front because of those fringe ideas about different realities, and moved away from how the things actually works or something like that? I know that it's not the question to be answered, but maybe you can relate to that and share your thoughts.
I think it's a good question, and it's a great deal more complicated than it seems on the outset. Now, the more I work with this stuff, the more I'm, you can say, skeptical about ideas actually influencing things too much in general. In the sense that, okay, let's say we have somebody who believes they can talk to spirits, right? Now, it might be the case that these spirits will tell them, let's say they get cancer, a classical example. It might be the case that the spirits will tell them, you must go to a folk cure, do not go to doctors. But it might also be the case that these same spirits will tell them, go get the best medical care you can. Because really this depends very much on what other ideas the person has that are channeled through this language of mysticism and esotericism. In a way, I know a lot of people sort of have beef with astrology specifically because it's often used to discriminate against people, for example, in hiring. You're not a Virgo, we do not want to hire not a Virgo for this detail-oriented job. But the thing is, all it does is that it presents the people who want to do the discrimination with a language of how they're going to put their sort of pre-existing biases into it. And the thing is, the more I work on this, the more I think that what's more important here from this perspective of influencing society is the biases themselves. It's more important to have good medicine than to crack down on, I don't know, urine therapy or whatever insane anti-medical practice happens this day. For example, people who do homeopathy are very often people who have encountered horrible side effects that their doctors just blew them off about, right? It's more important to have doctors that will treat you and listen to you about the side effects than to explain to people that homeopathy is, empty water. In a way, what these ideas do is they become vehicles for discontent, they become demonstrative of the cracks in society. They're not the causes of these cracks, right? But they are where these things become visible. In this case, I think that they're like, from a societal perspective, they're very valuable. Take a look at a working class esotericism section in a store, and you can find out a lot about what these people want. I mean, me and a friend of mine used to go around in Amsterdam looking at sort of Muslim stores, and there were candles, spiritualist candles that helped me find a good job as a teacher, doctor. What else was there? A construction person. Yeah, you know exactly who these people are aimed for, what sort of positions they can and cannot have as first-generation immigrants and so on. Those are considered good jobs, right?
So it's like an expression of those motivations and needs, and it gives a language to talk to yourself, like a reflective. So it's like why I am in that way, yeah, because you are sinner, or something like that. I am a good person. I'm talking now in like Christian terms. Yeah, why I am so good person? Oh, because I'm following the path of Jesus. So it's like a dictionary for to describe why, what is the place for me, why things happen that way. So it's like self-revealing prophecy or something like so, which you are telling to yourself after post-hoc rationalization or something like that.
Or as you're trying to make sense of something. Why is this happening to me right now?
Yeah.
And I think the good thing about it, is that many times it does help people keep going, in the sense that the most paralyzing thing is an inability to put things into words. Like, if you don't have a framework, if this reminds me of Franco and his secondary yes in the concentration camp. You can't find meaning in the horrors, right? Then you're screwed. You're probably going to die. But if you can find some sort of meaning, if you can find some sort of language, that makes it easier. Yeah, occasionally that language will lead you into a dead end. I am not discounting all of the situations where the honestly truly horrific situations where you have somebody going to a full cure, wasting time about a diagnosis with a time frame, right? But honestly, I don't think that happens as much as people finding
skeptics would like to portray. Yeah.
I haven't seen. I've seen a lot more situations where people don't go to doctors because they think that they're not going to find help with the doctors anyway, and then they wind up. Mm-hmm. And usually that's really predicated on prior medical trauma. And I think that would be like, if we want to change that, that's where we should be working and acting.
Kateryna, probably I have two last things. The first one is about my paranoia, and it's about that when I was researching on Alatra and Creative Society, and there were all the journalists and researchers who already did some kind of research, and there were a lot of people who were claiming that Alatra and Creative Society is pro-Russian, and me myself may be influenced by their claims or by the things which I seen. It looked like it's obvious, but the real threat, like the money or something like that, maybe FSB around the corner didn't show up. So I always I was a couple of times accused that I described Alatra as a pro-Russian movement, not fairly, and I was questioning if it's good way to go. It looked clearly for me, but I didn't have like clear evidence for that. I don't know if you know anything very detailed about Alatra, but my question is about post-Soviet new religious movements and their involvement with Russia propaganda and their such a movements as a tool for Russian political gains. Is it my
Okay, so first of all, I think I understand what you're getting at here. Now, I have to preface this with saying that I don't know anything about Alatra to the degree that I could speak authoritatively on them specifically, but I do know about FSB tactics and about how exactly the Russian thing goes. Now, the first thing that they do is that not nearly all of Russia, pro-Russian movements style themselves as pro-Russian, pro-nationalist. That's a much newer trend. What they're doing is they're styling themselves as globalist and everybody else as narrowly nationalist. This reminds me of the situation at the University of Tartu, where there was this woman who was saying that they failed at being true heritors of Yuri Lotman because they are saying that Russian isn't a more complicated and progressive language than they think Estonian. So, and therefore better for scientific pursuits. The whole idea is that for a very, very long time, what they did, the pro-Russian narrative is, we are the people, we are the bigger brothers of our shared destiny as humanity. Basically, they're using the rhetoric of humanity to disguise Russia. And this is actually a big problem, again, for humanist circles, because it's very easy to infiltrate them with that. So the thing is, you find the Russian thread when you look into the names, people, and geography, but in the rhetoric, you're not going to find it. You're going to find, we want to help all the people all over the world. And
Kateryna, so that's the case in Allatra.
Yeah.
So we are for all the people, for all the world. We include all the nations. But the rhetoric, the aspects, the accents are always, the rotten USA, rotten Europe, rotten culture, and the higher ground Slavic spirituality.
Bingo. Yep. Exactly. That's just normal. So this is a very, very standard approach. You see it in the Rerichian movements. One of the interesting one of the interesting groups that I want to again look in more detail, because I only had the opportunity to do a bit of a cursory overview for the thesis, is the Donetsk University had a pro-Rerichian group that I think mostly migrated to Russia after all of this. And I found out about them because one of the local mathematicians was involved in that. I do that won multiple Soviet prizes for things like, mining ventilation, and who taught math over there. So I found him through the sort of Soviet science pipeline.
Typical story, already.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is so much of this that is really, any movement that's sort of globalist esotericist has a very high chance of being hijacked by Russia. And as for FSB tactics and money, why do you need money to get people to do what they're doing already? Like, why would you pay people for that? In a way, I don't like the term useful dupes, but this is sort of the closest to it. If you get people to do what they think is important, you don't need to pay them. So,
but okay. But how those ideas play out with Russian ideology? How it is used? Is it just how to say? I want to try find a word to describe to disorientate the public, whatever, they don't know what is true, how the world works, what is bad or good guy, just total disorientation.
Basically, it's like we're the more educated people, we're the people who have actual science on our side, we're the people with sophisticated institutions, and these people are natives. They don't know anything. I remember there was a guy who was one of the prominent Russian anthropologists, Valery, I think it was his name, Chishkov, and he had this absolutely horrifying, text about sort of Russian science and so on. He's like, our Dagestani colleagues don't even want to name names. I don't know. I think they're just doing sloppy work. And they're working in a high conflict region with people sort of dying. They don't want to name names. I didn't want to name names in my thesis. There's a reason why I didn't go for interviews in the end. Not here, not right now, not while Russia's doing what it's doing. And they're like, this is just shoddy work. And I remember I did bring this up in the thesis. There was a case where there's a very famous case about Russian anthropology, about anthropologists going down a river and taking interviews with shamans. And then there was a steamboat that came down after the scholars collected those same shamans and shot them. And during my thesis, I met with a woman that was actually part of that same institution. And there was a moment when we were talking in the kitchen at Södertörn, and she was going, well, I mean, I've heard you guys have such serious problems with ethics reviews right now that it's very difficult to do real work. And I'm like, there was this one exemplary study of shamanism back in the 1940s, 50s. I don't remember. I think it was 30s and 40s, actually. And it was, I think, one of her older relatives, and it was amazing. We recorded everything, names, dates, and so on. And I was staring at her and was like, was that the one after which you got the steamboat? Is that the study you're talking about? And then she just looks at me and says, so what you are saying is that you're not allowed to do real work.
Oh my.
Yeah, that was very, very illuminating. That was incredibly illuminating, I have to say. And I was like, and in a very real way, this sort of globalism is, some of them believe it. For some of them, it's like, yeah, they do think that this is how you're supposed to do good work. But also, yeah, it's this whole nobody except the Russians actually knows anything about the world. Nobody has good publishing, nobody has good academia. We're just the better people here, and it's our responsibility and if you're opposing us, you're either stupid, misguided, or under the thumb of our enemies. So,
yeah. Kateryna, so what you like to say at the end? What's your take off, from your work? What you personally want to say? What you find out? What your ideas, and for our listeners in terms of your work? Just.
I think one is that, yeah, the Russian thing is definitely not just paranoia. And very often they do it in specifically this way where you sound paranoid if you talk about it. But as the old Soviet saying goes, you're not actually paranoid if they are watching you. But also, I think that one of the main lessons of Soviet esotericism is that the FSB and the KGB are not nearly as competent as they appear. There were multiple cases of resistance, and people fought them. People fought them off successfully, and they thrived regardless of the FSB's thumb, even if they sometimes went crazy about it, and were in a much better position than they were to fight back. So I think we should all do that. And the second thing, I've already said that possibly that was what I considered the most important. As I said, I do sympathize with the skeptical cause, with the idea that people should learn the truth about how the world works, and that people should have the access to the best information in making informed decisions. And that I would like everybody who works on this sort of thing to really take a look and digest the lessons of the Soviet Union, because they did a lot of things that seemed very intuitive to me in the beginning. Like, yeah, just give people education, just ask them what works for them and take them seriously. And then these things, because at the end of it, there's a saying that goes, science is a counterintuitive enterprise. The reason magical practices are so popular is because they're proto-scientific. They're obvious, elegant, and often wrong solutions that people have come to for millennia independently. And the fact that somebody that hasn't heard about a more complicated and a more elegant solution isn't the fault. It's sort of inevitable. The people who are interested in magic are, in many ways, I think, your natural allies if you can teach them properly. They're the people that listen to your popular science podcasts. They're the people who are interested in reality, in the truth. And if they're not taught well, you get what you get. But also that it's a much harder and much less intuitive thing than it seems to actually do popular science. And I'm very grateful that you guys and people like you are doing that. It's hard and worthwhile work. So, and we're all holding down our small layers of this line together. So, and hopefully we'll be able to make the future better for all of us in the end.
Kateryna, thank you. Слава Україні.
Героям слава. Дуже вам дякую, що запросили. Thank you very much for inviting me.
That was a Skeptics podcast. Kateryna Zorya, thank you very much again. And listen to this podcast on Spotify, watch it on YouTube and Patreon. Let's meet on the second episode. See ya.
Thank you so much.